The Apache woman bought the captive cowboy with 4 horses and 2 blankets, and that same night, crouching beside the fire while the camp listened, she told him plainly, "You will be my husband." His name was Eli Calloway. He had no ranch, no family waiting, no warrant on his name, just a road that kept getting narrower. It was the summer of 1874, deep in the Dragoon Mountains of the Arizona Territory, in the broken Red Rock country that had once belonged entirely to Cochise and his people. The Chiricahua Apache who found Eli that afternoon didn't find him by accident. They had been watching the canyon trails for weeks, and when a lone rider picked the wrong draw at the wrong hour, they were ready. He came into the camp bound at the wrists, bleeding from a cut above his ear, certain he was going to die before nightfall. He was wrong. But the reason he was wrong, the reason any of this happened, was a woman named Itza, and what she chose to do in the next 3 minutes would change both their lives in ways neither one of them could have predicted. Stay with this story, because it doesn't go the way you think it goes. 3 days before the ambush, Eli Calloway had been riding alone through the Bahada south of the Dragoons, trying to put distance between himself and the U.S. Army's 3rd Cavalry, not because he was a criminal, because he had refused an order. Eli grew up in eastern Texas, youngest of 3 brothers on a hardscrabble farm that produced mostly dust and hard feelings. He left at 17, drifted west through New Mexico on the back of any paying work he could find, driving cattle, laying fence, the jobs nobody else wanted because nobody else was hungry enough. By his mid-20s, he had crossed the desert enough times to know how it worked, how to read the country, which water holes held through July, and which were already sand by June. Over years of riding through Apache territory, he had picked up enough of the Chiricahua and Mescalero dialects to get by. Not fluency, but enough to parlay, enough to listen, enough to follow the drift of a conversation, even when it wasn't meant for him. The Army hired him as a civilian scout in the spring of 1872. He was good at it. He knew the trails, didn't complain about the hours, and his ability to negotiate water and grazing rights with the bands along the supply routes had saved the 3rd Cavalry enough grief that his commanding officer put his name in for a formal commendation in the winter of 1873. He read it in the officer's mess and felt something close to pride for maybe 30 seconds, which was about how long pride ever lasted for Eli before he talked himself out of it. Then came April of 1874 and Lieutenant Crane and a sleeping camp in the Sulphur Springs Valley. The column moved before dawn. The Army's habit in those years, get close in the dark, hit hard at first light when people are still half asleep. Eli had been assigned to ride point, confirm the position of the camp, and report back. He confirmed it. The camp was there, a small gathering of Chiricahua families in a shallow arroyo, 60 or 70 people. He counted the cook fires, 6. He counted the horses in the rope pen, about 20. He put the number of warriors at maybe 15, the rest women, children, elders. He rode back and told Lieutenant Crane exactly what he had seen. Crane said, "Good. Take the scouts forward and drive them towards the column." Eli sat on his horse in the gray pre-dawn light and looked at the lieutenant. He thought about the children, curled in their blankets, the way the camp looked from the high ground, small and ordinary and asleep. He thought about what it would look like in 20 minutes. He said no. Crane drew his sidearm. He repeated the order twice, voice going up a half step each time. Around Eli, the other scouts went very still. Eli put his hands on his saddle horn and said, again, no. He was disarmed, stripped of his scouting papers, sent south on foot with 1 day's rations. The other scouts looked away. The column moved without him. He never found out exactly what happened at the camp that morning. He heard versions of it over the following months. Different people telling different parts. None of it clean, none of it the kind of story you repeat at a table. By the time he bought a horse from a freighter near Tombstone and started riding again, the story of the scout who refused had already traveled faster than he had. It came ahead of him everywhere he went. Doors closed. Work dried up. Some men called him a coward. Some called him a traitor. A few, very few, said nothing at all and looked at him with something he couldn't quite read. Something that might have been respect, might have been pity, was probably some of both. He stopped trying to explain it. His horse had stood still in the dark above that arroyo and not moved forward, and he had let it stand. He didn't think of it as a decision exactly, more like a discovery, finding out, under pressure, what he was actually made of. He hadn't liked everything he'd found over the years, but that one thing he could live with. He was heading nowhere in particular when he rode into that canyon. He knew the dragoons were Chiricahua country. He knew riding through them alone was either brave or stupid, and he was honest enough with himself to know it was probably the latter. He wasn't reckless by nature. He was just tired. There's a difference, though. From the outside, those two things can look the same. The warriors took him fast, without ceremony. Two men appearing on his left, from a rock shelf, as if they had stepped out of the stone, one more directly ahead on a higher ledge with a rifle already leveled. He didn't reach for his gun. He put his hands up and hoped that counted for something. It counted for his life, at least temporarily. They rode 2 hours into the mountains, climbing through juniper and pinon, the trail switching back so many times Eli lost any sense of direction. When the camp opened before him, wickiups in a sheltered bowl, ringed by red stone, cook fires going, the smell of meat and juniper smoke. He had the odd feeling of having arrived somewhere, though he couldn't have said where or why that word came to him. They bound him to a post near the center of the camp and left him there while the band's headmen and elders gathered. The conversation around him wasn't quiet. He could follow pieces of it, enough to understand that the question of what to do with him was genuinely open, and that the arguments on the side of killing him weren't weak. He was a trespasser, he was army, he was white, which in that country, in that year, carried a particular and exhausting history of betrayal. He kept his face still and waited. Then something shifted in the sound of the gathering. He heard a woman's voice, not louder than the others, not urgent, but deliberate in a way that changed the texture of the whole room. He couldn't see her from where he was tied, but he could hear the silence that followed, and that silence told him the voice had weight behind it. She spoke again, longer, and there was a murmuring response from the men around the fire. Then, footsteps. She walked into his line of sight. She looked to be in her mid-20s, though the desert made it hard to gauge. She moved with the ease of someone who had learned not to waste motion. Not arrogance, just efficiency. A body that had found its most economical way of being in the world. She wore a deerskin dress, worked with geometric patterns along the hem. Dark hair pinned at one side with a carved piece of bone. She stopped in front of the headmen, said something Eli could only half follow, and then walked directly to where he was tied. She studied him with the unhurried attention of a woman making a calculation, not a judgment. He met her eyes and held them, and tried to look like a man who had not been afraid for the past 2 hours, which wasn't entirely true, but was the best he could do. She said, in careful English, "You will not be killed." Eli said, "I appreciate that." She said, "I bought you." A pause. 4 horses, 2 blankets. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. She said, "You will be my husband." And that was how it started. Her name was Itza. She had been a widow for 2 winters. Her husband Dosela killed in a skirmish near the Sulphur Springs Valley, the same country where Eli had later refused his order. She hadn't made that connection yet when she bought him. She made it later. She was the band's healer, the woman people came to at night when fevers came, or when the difficult births arrived in the dark. She had built that standing herself, year after year, through a knowledge of the desert's medicine that ran deeper than anyone else in the camp, and a patience with people in pain that never seemed to run dry. Her standing went beyond her husband's name, which mattered. A widow without standing was a woman without protection in a world that moved fast and hard. She had built what she had herself, and she knew it, and she carried that knowledge without needing to announce it. She had been watching Eli since they brought him in. She had heard enough from riders and traders over the preceding months to know that an army scout had refused an order near Sulphur Springs, heard the broad shape of it, not the details. She also heard what the refusal had cost him. She didn't know his name, she didn't know the full story, but she had been watching his face while the headmen discussed his death, and she had seen no fear in it. She had seen stillness, not bravado, not resignation, something quieter than either, the kind that belongs to a man who has already been through the worst version of a thing, and is just waiting to see what this version brings. She was not rescuing him. She told him that specifically, that first night, through a mix of careful English and Chiricahua that would become their shared language over the weeks that followed. She said, not saved, chosen. She said she needed a man who could be trusted at the edge of camp in the early hours, a lookout, a second set of eyes, someone who understood how white men moved through country and could read the approach of trouble from the south. She said 4 horses was what the elders required to take the transaction seriously. She said he was useful to her. Eli listened to all of this and said, "What does husband mean to your people?" She said, "It means you eat at my fire, you guard my lodge, you work with the band's men, you do not leave without telling me where you are going." He said, "That sounds more like employment," she said without smiling. "Yes." He slept that first night at the edge of her wickiup, still bound, though the rope was loose enough to be a formality. He lay on his back, listening to the mountain sounds, insects, wind through the high pines, a coyote somewhere down the canyon, and tried to understand what had just happened. A woman he had never met paid horses to keep him alive, called him her husband, and then described the arrangement like a labor contract. He couldn't decide whether to be relieved or insulted. He settled on grateful, which was simpler, and fell asleep. He did not sleep well, but he slept. And when he woke before dawn, with the cold coming down off the rock walls and the camp still dark around him, he lay there for a long moment, taking stock of the situation, with the practical part of his mind that had kept him alive in difficult places before. He was not in chains. He had been fed. The woman who claimed to own him had walked away from him without fear, which meant either she trusted his gratitude or she trusted that her people would correct any mistake he made before he got far. Probably both. Either way, running made no sense. He didn't know which way was out of these mountains. He wouldn't get 2 miles in the dark without water. And the truth was, something in him didn't want to run, didn't want to go back to the road south of the Dragoons, the closing doors, the story everyone had already decided to tell about him. So he lay there in the dark until the first gray light came up, and then he got up and waited to see what the day wanted from him. The first week was not comfortable. The band's warriors tolerated him the way you tolerate a tool someone else has chosen. Useful in theory, unproven in practice, watched carefully for the first sign of a problem. The older men barely acknowledged him. The younger ones watched him with the open, flat assessment of men, deciding how much of a threat he was. Only Itza treated him as simply present, which was its own kind of strange comfort. She cut his bonds on the second morning without ceremony, handed him a clay bowl of stew, and returned to her work. He sat outside her wickiup and ate and watched the camp go through its day and tried to make himself small and unthreatening. Not a skill he had practiced much, but he turned out to have more aptitude for it than he expected. On the third day, she put him to work. Several of the band's horses had hoof problems from a long run of rocky trail. Eli had spent enough time in army corrals to know something about hooves. He spent most of that day crouched in the high sun, picking stones, trimming, packing the damaged tissue with chewed, prickly pear pulp, the way an old mescalero horse healer had shown him years back. The horses stood easier by evening. He said nothing about it to anyone. Itza said nothing either. But he noticed her watching from across the clearing when she thought he wasn't looking. On the fourth day, she took him with her to gather medicine in the rocky draws above camp, brittle bush, Mormon tea, dried seed pods of desert willow, a low succulent she called something he couldn't repeat yet. She gave him the Chiricahua names for things and corrected his pronunciation when he tried, with the patience and precision of a teacher whose student is close but not quite there. He paid attention not just to the words, but to how she moved through the desert, which plants she passed without slowing, which she stopped for, how she checked the undersides of leaves before cutting, how she talked quietly to herself while she worked. He had seen that quality in good trackers, in the best army surgeons, in a few craftsmen who really knew their trade. He hadn't often seen it so clearly in anyone. He told her about the army on that fourth day. Not as a defense, just because they were alone in a quiet canyon, and the silence had grown comfortable enough to talk into. He told her about the pre-dawn column, the sleeping camp below, the way it looked from the high ground, the children in their blankets. He told her about the lieutenant's voice and his horse standing still in the dark, and the choice that hadn't entirely felt like a choice. Itza listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Docella was killed near there, 2 years before." He didn't speak. Nothing he could have said would have been adequate. After a moment, she said, "I don't think you are a good man or a bad man. I think you are someone who hasn't decided yet what to be." He turned that over for 3 days before he figured out she was right. The shape of his days settled into something that had no name in either of his languages. He rose before dawn, walked the camp's perimeter, came back, ate, worked through the morning, alongside whoever needed help. Firewood, hides, equipment maintenance, the dozen daily tasks that keep a mountain camp running. Afternoons, he was often with Itza, helping carry supplies on her rounds or sitting at the edge of the clearing while she worked, and he watched and learned what he could. Evenings they sat at her fire. The band's head man was an older man named Sala, who had seen enough of white promises and white failures to regard Eli with a skepticism that was almost geological in its depth. For 3 weeks he simply looked through Eli at meals, as if Eli were a rock that had been placed in his field of vision, and might or might not move on its own eventually. He didn't speak English, and made no acknowledgement that Eli was attempting Chiricahua. The morning that changed was the morning Sala found a young man named Hadesta with a broken forearm, bone visibly misaligned from a fall, joints swelling dark and fast. Hadesta breathing in tight, shallow gulps. Itza was there within minutes, her saddlebag already open on the ground. She looked at the arm, then at Eli. "Do you know how to set a broken bone?" he said. "I've watched it done," she said. "Watching is different from knowing," he said. "I know, but I think I can feel where the bone wants to go." She held his gaze for a moment, reading something there, and stepped aside. It took 3 minutes and was not gentle, and Hadesta made a sound that Eli felt in his own back teeth. But when they splinted it and checked the color returning to the fingers and felt the pulse at the wrist, the alignment was right. Sala had been standing 2 feet away the whole time. He said nothing, He nodded once, short, definitive, the kind of nod that means the matter is settled, and walked away. After that, Eli was part of the camp. Not fully, not without the ongoing weight of being what he was, in a place that had every reason to distrust what he was, but included, given the flat, practical acknowledgement that he was pulling his weight and not making trouble. That evening at the fire, Itza was quieter than usual, and he noticed something in the space between them that had changed. Not the distance, but the quality of it. More honest. As if they had both set down something that they had been carrying since the first night, and hadn't thought to put down until now. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. He said, "When you traded for me, did you already know I was the scout from Sulphur Springs?" She was quiet a moment. Then, "I knew someone had refused the order. I didn't know your face. I watched your face when they talked about killing you. That's when I decided." He said, "What did you see?" She said, "You weren't afraid of dying." "You were afraid of dying for nothing." He didn't answer. He looked into the fire and felt the truth of it the way you feel. Something when someone names it out loud for the first time. Not quite a surprise, but a recognition that has its own small weight. He said quietly, "And now?" She looked at him from across the fire. The light was unsteady and orange, the mountains black above, the camp quiet all around them. She said, "Now you are here. If you've been watching, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more story left, and you won't want to miss how it ends." The trouble arrived from the south on a Tuesday morning, moving slow and careless through the lower canyon, the way people move when they think they haven't been seen yet. Scalp Hunters. 8 men working under a loose Sonoran commission that paid $5 per scalp, with no requirement for age, sex, or proof of anything much beyond the taking. They were not army, not official in any formal sense. They were men who had found a market for a certain kind of work and organized themselves around it, the same way other men organized around cattle or silver, except that what these men moved was suffering, and they had been at it long enough to have stopped thinking of it as anything unusual. Eli found their sign first, on an early morning circuit of the Eastern Draw, 3 days before anyone else knew they were close. Boot prints in the red dust, where boot prints had no business being. A cold campfire, in a pinon thicket, carefully scattered but not careful enough. He could see the edge of the fire ring when the morning light hit it at the right angle. The smell of horse from the wrong direction. Faint, but out of place in the way that anything wrong is wrong when you've been paying attention long enough. He went straight to Itza and described what he'd found. She listened with her arms crossed and her face still, then went to Tsala without appearing to hurry. Eli stood at the edge of that conversation and followed enough of it to get the shape. Scouts to the high draws, women and children to the upper hollow, warriors positioned along the 3 main approach routes. It was a practice thing, a plan run before, refined through use. Watching it move with that calm efficiency told him something he filed away, that this band had survived this exact kind of threat before, and had survived it by being better prepared than whoever was coming. Tsala looked at Eli, said something in Chiricahua about the Eastern Trail, the draw where Eli had found the sign, which offered a line of sight down the whole lower approach. Eli said, "Yes." No hesitation. He meant it the way he had meant the refusal at Sulphur Springs, not a decision requiring deliberation, just a statement of what he already was. He spent the next 2 hours in a juniper thicket above the draw, with a rifle borrowed from a warrior named Chato, watching the trail below. The Scalp Hunters came at first light, moving in loose file. 8 of them, exactly as he had guessed from the sign. They came around the lower bend without caution, in the unhurried way of men who don't expect to be watched before they're ready to be seen. What happened in the next 15 minutes was fast and not clean, and he did not feel good about any of it afterward, which was, he thought, probably the correct response. 3 of the 8 turned back in the first minute when shots broke from the rocks above camp. 2 more scattered east toward the lower desert and did not come back. The remaining 3 made a push toward the high hollow before Chato's men drove them off the trail with fire from 3 positions. Nobody in the camp was killed. One of the band's younger warriors took a round across the shoulder, not deep, that Itza packed and dressed before the sun was fully up. She worked quickly and without fuss, talking to the warrior in a low, steady voice the whole time. Eli held what she needed and handed things to her without being asked, and tried not to think about the men down in the draw. The 3 who had scattered east would reach a settlement within 2 days. He knew that. Whatever quiet the band had kept in that part of the Dragoons was probably finished now. He told Itza that afternoon, straight, without softening it. She said, "We know." He said, "I can't be the reason they find this camp. I won't be what leads soldiers here." She looked at him and said, "Are you leaving?" The question was simple. Her face was its usual, steady surface, but he had been watching her face for 6 weeks by then, long enough to read what wasn't on it, the careful stillness she put up when something mattered and she didn't want it to show. He said, "No, I'm staying. I wanted you to know that I understand what that means." She held his gaze and said, "I know what it means too." He said, "Then we understand each other." She said, "We have for a while." They stood in the afternoon shade for a moment, and then she went back to her patients, and he went to help Chato's men cover the camp's tracks in the eastern draw. Neither said anything else, because there was nothing left to say on the subject. The camp moved 3 days later, north and west, into a new canyon that the band knew and Eli was still learning. It took 2 full days, the practiced work of people who had survived, by being willing to unroot themselves without making a ceremony of the grief. Eli worked alongside the band's men both days, carrying and lashing and driving the horse herd through the narrow trail, and felt the satisfaction of a body working hard at something that needed doing. Sala said 4 words to him on the second morning. Itza translated. He said, "You carry like someone who intends to stay." Eli said, "Tell him he's right." The new canyon was cooler, walls high enough to block the late afternoon sun, a spring, running cold even in August. The band settled in within 3 days. The rhythms came back fast, the way they do when people have long practice at making home from whatever the land offers. About a week after the move, Sala called a gathering and spoke for a long time about the land and its changes, about what survival required, about the warriors who had held the eastern draw. He spoke about Hadesta's healed arm. He spoke about the man who had stood on the trail that morning and fired when he didn't have to. Then he looked at Eli and said a sentence that Itza translated quietly. "The camp claims him." No ceremony was made of it. The gathering just shifted in a small, definite way, the way a group shifts when the last point of argument is taken off the table. The men around the fire looked at Eli with the uncomplicated directness of men who have made a decision and are done deliberating. The women went back to their work. The children, who had been watchful at the edges of things, moved a few steps closer, the way children do when the adults have decided something is safe. That night at the fire, the silence between Eli and Itza had a different quality. Settled, finally. The difference between 2 people still deciding, and 2 people who have decided, and who both know it. He said, "You never asked me if I wanted to be your husband." She said, "No." He said, I'm telling you now that I do." She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight. Her face did something it rarely did, a slight softening around the eyes, a giving way of the controlled steadiness she wore, as naturally as most people wear their expressions. She said, I know." He said, "Is that an answer?" She said, "It's the only one I have." He put his hand flat on the ground between them. After a moment, she placed her hand over his, and they sat that way while the fire burned down, the camp moving through its quiet sounds around them, and neither spoke because there was nothing left to decide. Before the ceremony, there were things to arrange. Itza explained the obligations carefully over several evenings, and he listened the way he listened to everything she taught him, without interrupting, asking questions only when she paused and looked at him to see if he had followed. There were gifts to be made and received, acknowledgments that had to pass through the proper hands before anything could be considered settled. Eli spent 2 weeks braiding a set of horse hobbles from good rawhide for Tzala's nephew, another week repairing a cracked rifle stock for one of the elders, fitting a new piece of cherry wood, shaping it with a borrowed knife until it sat right. These were not tokens. They were the language of commitment, spoken through work rather than words, and he understood that in the way that sometimes a person stumbles into a fluency they didn't know they had. The ceremony itself, when it came in October, was quiet. A gathering of the band's families around an evening fire, head men and elders in their places, a recitation of obligations that Tzala led and that Eli followed, with about 60% comprehension and 100% intention. Itza stood next to him in the worked deerskin dress. When Tzala addressed them both, she answered for herself first, and then translated for Eli. And Eli answered in the Chiricahua he had been practicing, imperfectly, with errors he knew he was making, even as he made them. And there was a sound from the gathered band that he would have called fond if he had been asked to name it, the sound of people watching someone try hard at something that matters and mostly getting it right. He did not become Chiricahua. That is not how it works, and by then he understood that better than he would have at the beginning. He remained what he was, a man between two worlds, a former army scout who had fired on no one and belonged nowhere in particular. But he had a place in that canyon, at that fire, beside that woman. He had work that needed doing, and people who needed it done. He had a winter coming, and the comfort of knowing exactly where he was going to be when it arrived. The winter in the new canyon was hard, the way high desert winters are hard, not brutal in the lowland sense, but cold enough and long enough to make demands on preparation and patience. He was not unprepared. He had been learning from the day he arrived, the vigilance required to live well in that country, and the learning had not stopped. There was always more. The mountain always had another lesson for anyone patient enough to sit with it. Itza taught without appearing to teach. She answered questions fully, and then let him work things out himself, which was, he came to understand, how she had learned everything she knew, by watching, by doing, by failing quietly, and adjusting without performance. By midwinter he was managing about 70% of his daily conversation in Chiricahua Apache. He still made errors that made the children laugh, which he had learned to receive as a gift rather than an embarrassment, because the sound of children laughing in a camp is one of the sounds that means everything is all right. He still had days when the loneliness of being between worlds pressed on him, in ways he couldn't explain, to anyone who hadn't felt it, the ache of a man who no longer belongs entirely to where he came from and is not yet entirely of where he has chosen to go. He mentioned it to Itza one cold night when the wind was working at the walls and the fire was the whole world. She said, Docella felt that way for 2 years after he came back from trading in the valley towns. He said it stops when you stop looking backward. He asked, "Did he stop?" She said, "Yes. Eventually." He said, "How long is eventually?" She said, "I'll tell you when we get there." He left it at that. Itza's answers were always exactly as long as they needed to be, and trying to stretch them further was a waste of effort. Spring came slowly, and then all at once, the way it does in the high desert, cold, retreating by degrees, and then gone in a single week of warm south wind that turned the canyon walls from tan to something near gold. The band's winter stores had held. The horses had come through. Hadesta was riding again. Tsala looked, if not pleased. Eli had never seen him look pleased exactly. Then settled, which was the closest Tsala got. Eli stood at the mouth of the canyon one morning, in what he figured was early April, watching the light come across the ridgeline in long bars of orange and red. He thought about the nothing that had been waiting for him south of Tombstone the day the warriors found him, the long road to nowhere, the doors closing ahead of him one after another, the feeling of a man being slowly defined by everyone else's story about him. He thought about it the way you think about a country you lived in once, a long time ago, with a mild and distancing curiosity, like coming across your own handwriting from 10 years back and barely recognizing it. Behind him, the camp was waking. Wood catching fire, a child's voice carrying across the cold air, the horses shifting in the rope pen at the far end of the hollow. He heard Itza moving inside the wickiup, the ordinary sounds of her morning work, close and familiar, and his. He stood there long enough for the light to fully clear the ridgeline, long enough to feel the warmth coming back into the stone walls, long enough to make his peace with every version of himself that had gotten him here, to this canyon, by this long and crooked route, to this particular morning. Then he turned around and went back to his life. That is the shape of Eli Calloway's story. It doesn't wrap clean. The Arizona territory kept changing around them. The army kept moving through those mountains. The Chiricahua kept being pressed from every direction by forces that had no intention of stopping. None of that stopped. But for a long while, in a canyon in the Dragoon Mountains in the last quarter of the 19th century, there was a fire burning at the entrance of a wickiup, and two people sitting beside it who had each chosen the other, clearly, on purpose, with their eyes open. Itza had not rescued him. She had looked at a man at the edge of a hard moment and seen what he was made of, and she had made a decision based on what she saw, not saved, chosen. She knew the difference, and she had known it mattered. A man saved is in debt. A man chosen is an equal. He had proven her right, not by doing anything spectacular, just by being what she had seen in him from the start, someone who, given a real choice, took the harder and more honest one. He had stood on the Eastern Trail when he didn't have to. He had learned the language of a people his own country wanted him to regard as enemies, and found the language fit his mouth better than he expected. He had sat on his horse in the dark above the Sulphur Springs Valley and refused to be what the army wanted him to be. And then he had ridden alone into the mountains and been found by people who offered him a different kind of question. Not what will you refuse, but what will you build, and with whom, and how long are you willing to stay? His answer was a cold canyon and a long winter, and a woman's hand on top of his in the firelight. Whatever came after that, they would figure out together. If this story stayed with you, hit like and come back. There are a lot more stories from this country, and none of them go the way you expect.